Welcome, everyone. Welcome to the 2018 Proust Rule of Law lecture. I'm Kevin Dundalk. I'm the executive director of the Henry Institute here at Calvin College, where I'm also a professor of political science. The namesake of this lecture is Donald Proust, a longtime professor of business here at Calvin. While he passed away last year, we celebrate his legacy through this lecture, and especially his focus on the importance of the rule of law. We thank Ed and Ruth Zielstra for helping us carry out that legacy. They couldn't be with us tonight. We couldn't align our schedules, but they have been longtime supporters of Don and this lecture. I'd also like to extend a special welcome to participants in the Faith and Democracy Conference here at Calvin, and to thank Acton Institute for its partnership as the lead sponsor. The lecture this evening doubles as a fitting plenary in the conference, and we look forward to more conversation tomorrow, culminating in our second plenary at 1:15 in this same space. I think it's in the same space. It's in this building, but it may be here or next door in Willow, but I think it's here in this space. That lecture will feature Calvin's own Jamie Smith. My sense is that we might get something somewhat contrasting, a contrasting perspective from what we'll hear from our speaker tonight if the sort of dueling titles play out. And now our speaker. Patrick J. Deneen is a professor of political science and holds the David A. Potenziani Memorial Chair of Constitutional Studies at the University of Notre Dame. Prior to joining the faculty of Notre Dame in 2012, he taught at Princeton University and Georgetown University. Dr. Deneen received a bachelor's degree in English literature from Rutgers University in 1986 and his PhD in political science, also from Rutgers, in 1995. His books include The Odyssey of Political Theory, Democratic Faith, Conserving America, ? And most recently, Why Liberalism Failed, which appeared in January 2018 with Yale University Press. That last book is a work of political theory combined with a touch of the Jeremiad, and it has the rare distinction in that genre of becoming something of a blockbuster, both in and outside academic circles. Its ideas have also been the central organizing themes of our conference here today and tomorrow. In addition to academic work, you can catch Dr. Deneen's writing in journals of opinion, including First Things, The American Conservative, The Weekly Standard, Chronicle of Higher Education, and Commonweal. Dr. Deneen will take a few questions after his talk. I'll moderate that, and we'll end promptly at 7:30. Would you all join me in welcoming Patrick Deneen?
To lower the microphone. Thank you. Thank you so much, Kevin, for that kind introduction. And also thank you for not allowing Jason Peters to introduce me, whose introductions are notoriously false. Yours was accurate. When I told my son that I'd be delivering a lecture at Calvin College, he asked me to deliver a message to you. Calvin stinks. He goes to Hope College, so, no, I'm very honored to be back at Calvin. I think it's been about a decade. I think about 10 years ago I attended the Henry Institute conference and was delighted to visit Calvin for the first time, and doubly delighted today because I didn't have to get on an airplane. The trip was pretty pleasant, involving no delays at airports. So that was very nice. So I thought I would, when I saw Professor Smith's title, Thank God for Liberalism, I thought I would offer an alternative perspective. It seemed to me a nice opportunity to do that. And for the first time in probably about a year, I actually prepared something new rather than just kind of rehearsing my shtick to talk about my book. So I apologize in advance for what's probably a fairly rough set of ideas, and I also very much welcome the opportunity to speak with you and interact about these thoughts afterwards. The title of my talk is Liberalism is Not Free, The Myth of Religious Liberty. In many ways, both this talk and the book that was just mentioned, Why Liberalism Failed, had one of its inspirations was an essay, an important essay written by the political philosopher Leo Strauss. It's a short study of modern political thought, and it's entitled The Three Waves of Modernity. I recommend it to you, those of you interested in the history of political thought that might not have read it yet. In that relatively short but very rich essay, Strauss traces how modernity developed in what he calls three waves, each development using the image of a wave feeding into a subsequent development, much like the kind of backwash of a wave as it recedes from the shore is picked up by the subsequent wave, forms part of that subsequent wave, adding to it even as it's absorbed and given a new form by that subsequent breaker. So I think the image of the waves isn't only inspired by a line in Plato's Republic, but it forms a very, it seems to me, accurate symbol of what Strauss is describing. And what his essay insightfully shows is how one philosophical movement generated a reaction that at once rejected some of the key tenets of its predecessor, while also incorporating elements of that predecessor philosophy in ways that wouldn't have been possible or available before the realization of that previous philosophical school. So thus, in the course of that essay, Strauss argues that modernity, broadly speaking, was inaugurated in the first instance by a radical break with classical and Christian pre-modernity, beginning with the naturalist philosophy developed in its incipient form by Machiavelli and by Francis Bacon, and receiving full political expression in the thought of Thomas Hobbes and John Locke. This first wave of modernity, once it crested, fed into its reaction or a reaction against it, and its successor wave, namely modern historicism, inaugurated especially in the thought of Jean-Jacques Rousseau. Rousseau, of course, both adopted the state of nature philosophy of those previous thinkers while adapting it as well, in order, in particular, to advance the view, in contrast to his predecessors, not that we could look at the state of nature to understand human nature in its essence, but rather that human nature was in fact historically constructed and thus malleable through historical forces. Once recognizing this fact, it followed, this plastic historical nature could actually eventually become the subject of human direction by the control of history and the course of history itself, a view that was to influence thinkers ranging from Kant to Hegel to Marx. And we could include in that someone like Francis Fukuyama, The End of History. In turn, this wave, the second wave of modernity, fed a reaction by those who embraced the ideal of human self-making while rejecting the humanist and progressive beliefs of the historicist school, arguing instead for human self-creation and self-realization, now in the name simply of power and of human greatness, above all articulated in the philosophy of Nietzsche and then subsequently Heidegger. Strauss concluded quite suggestively that these three waves corresponded and indeed inspired the three great contending political ideologies of the 20th century, or beginning a bit earlier than that, but certainly contesting in the 20th century. Liberal democracy arising from the first wave, communism arising from the second wave, and fascism arising from the third wave. At the time that he wrote, only two of these were standing, and today it would seem only one, though it appears at least hobbled, along with possible signs of life from the two alternatives that we might have once believed had been mortally wounded, if not slain. Now, Strauss's analysis considerably informed my own understanding of the relationship between the various liberalisms that I discussed in my recent book, Why Liberalism Failed, and in particular the connection between what is typically understood to be classical liberalism on the one hand, what we often in our context call conservatism, and progressive liberalism on the other, or what we sometimes call liberalism. We live in a nation that has, at least for a century, divided itself between these two forms of liberalism, with each side characteristically claiming that if the one false articulation of liberalism could be excised, then the true and good liberalism would emerge pristine and purified. And thus, conservative liberals have embraced a narrative that the good American founding was tainted by the foreign contagion of the second wave, of particularly German philosophy, namely historicism, which informed and inspired the rise of the political movement known as progressivism. And to the contrary, progressives regard the path to progress as having been disrupted by the emergence of what is now called neoliberalism, an updated, recent, and potent rearticulation of classical liberalism. Both positions aspire to purify their preferred liberalism by eliminating the wayward and detachable recent development of a pathological and curable form of liberalism. What Strauss's analysis suggests is that there is a deeper continuity and even consonance between these philosophies, one arising from the powerful advance of its predecessor, yet far from simply constituting its replacement, can be understood in a sense to contain fundamental elements of its antecedent. Now, if one views one's philosophy, one's preferred philosophy, from within that philosophical school, it's the differences that loom large, and indeed that which in many ways informs our politics. Since from within each wave, one naturally views the other waves as the antithesis of one's own position. Thus, even as Strauss suggests, being at war with one another, and thus why liberal democracy, fascism, and communism all end up fighting each other. But viewed from outside the philosophical systems, viewed now in the kind of as a process of set of waves, each is not only inextricably connected, but in fact shares the kind of intimate relationship of a progenitor and an offspring. So it's in this vein and in light of this form of analysis that I want to explore tonight the connection between the apparently opposite camps in today's debate over the status of religious liberty in the United States. Today we have an alignment that increasingly pits largely religious believers who invoke the religious liberty enshrined in the tradition of classical liberalism against the growing skepticism of the legitimacy of such claims by secularist progressive liberals. And I want to explore, not as is typically the case, not simply the differences between these two camps of liberalism, but some of their core similarities, even how they are, in some senses, different iterations of the same phenomenon. So at the risk of some simplification, I am a political scientist after all, I want to suggest that there are three stages of the relationship of religion and politics, broadly speaking, in American history that align in some ways with these philosophical developments. These three waves reflect different settlements of religion and politics within the liberal tradition in America. First, classical liberalism, with its separation of church and state. Second, the American civil religion, reflecting a consensus American way of life that at once allowed for and indeed celebrated various religious traditions, while also commanding near universal fidelity to an American creed. And third, the secularist true belief of today's progressives, at once deeply hostile to the first settlement in particular, while I will suggest arising from the basic logic from within liberalism itself. Now, we tend to focus on two of these iterations in our politics today, the first and the last, in a pitched battle over the future of the nation. And indeed, from within the perspective of each, they do appear to be polar opposites. But as I want to suggest that in many ways, these two forms of liberalism are connected in some ways by the kind of the center, the central form of the liberal settlement, in particular, the rise of the high water mark of consensus liberalism, with a kind of admixture of biblical religious traditions, Judeo-Christianity as it was called, that began in which the various religions began to merge with liberalism, giving rise to a period that observers such as the late Robert Bellah regarded as American civil religion. Now, while each of these settlements is distinct and marked by important differences, what each certainly shares in common is the alignment of church or churches or religions and the liberal regime. While apparently brought into existence to allow for the separation of church and state, what a retrospective overview of the unfolding stages of American religious history evinces is the persistence of a kind of civil religion throughout its history, albeit articulated in different forms. That is, what is revealed is ultimately the development of a path of liberalism in which first the principle is established that the churches are controlled ultimately by and under the liberal state. Second, to a settlement in which the churches increasingly and voluntarily conform themselves to the core principles of liberalism, the second stage. And lastly, to one in which liberalism itself becomes a religion, with its institutional locus being, perhaps in some fundamental way, the liberal state, but along with its attendant institutions of university, industry, culture, and so forth, where there are housed today the new clerisy and the enforcers of orthodoxy. Discernible then throughout these stages is the alignment of liberalism and religion, albeit in different guises, and as a result, what I suggest is in fact the myth of religious liberty as a ground condition of liberalism, whose mirage now becomes more fully visible. So let me begin with the first of these waves. We typically regard a core feature of liberalism to be the separation of church and state. Ask your students or ask young people if they know anything about history, the Constitution, and that might be one of the first things they will reply. And that liberalism launches in some ways this fundamental separation. But of course, those, at least with some historical understanding, recognize that liberalism in its earliest stages launches with an opposite arrangement, namely the establishment of the churches within sovereign boundaries. This was, of course, in many ways a long-standing pre-liberal condition, proto-liberal condition, the European condition that began with, or at least was codified with the Treaty of Augsburg, cuius regio eius religio, whose realm, his religion, and was reflected as well at the time of the American founding. What is often forgotten is that the First Amendment of the United States was crafted in light of the arrangement that existed in the states at the time, formerly sovereign polities, which was inscribed in our Constitution to forbid the federal government from establishing a national religion in deference to the established religion in the individual states, defined by what had been sovereign boundaries. The First Amendment then forbid a national religion and barred the federal government from interfering in the free exercise of religion within the states. Now, consequences of the official establishment of state religions frequently provided preferential financial treatment to these established churches and to schools, and at times required public figures to be members of the established church and not infrequently forbade office holding and property ownership by those of certain religions, most commonly Catholics, often well into the 19th century. The disestablishments of these religions were not overturned by an act of Congress or judicial decisions, but by gradual acts of state legislatures. And the understanding that there was a separation of church and state wasn't in fact codified until rather late into the 20th century. But these disestablishments occurred throughout the 19th century, Connecticut, my home state, disestablishing in 1818, Massachusetts in 1833, and New Hampshire not until 1877. In all, 10 of the original 13 states had official state establishments at the time of the American founding. So when we speak of this be the separation of church and state being a core principle of liberalism or the American founding, a different story needs to be understood. Today, we naturally regard state establishment to be the opposite of disestablishment. And we have, of course, interpreted the First Amendment to mean the very opposite of what it was originally intended to receive. However, the two approaches to the relationship of religion and the state at the outset of the liberal order, in fact, affect an identical end. What my colleague Brad Gregory has described in his book, The Unintended Reformation, as the control of the churches. As he writes there, while establishment and disestablishment look different, in fact, he says, look obviously different. I'll quote him here, if we shift our analytical focus from individuals to institutions, and from the recognition of rights to the exercise of power, things appear differently. Whether in Western confessional, liberal, or totalitarian regimes, states control churches. Whether they prescribe, permit, or proscribe religion, they do so on their own terms, exercising an institutional monopoly of power in the public sphere. The trajectory of state governments in the United States, and ultimately to a universal and even today mandated universal disestablishment, in fact, interestingly tracks the intellectual development of liberalism's architect, John Locke. His earlier work, not much read by many at least students of political thought today, the Two Tracts of Government, written in 1660, Locke argued for the state establishment, for an established religion, for reasons identical to that of Thomas Hobbes, who he so often contrasted with, that Thomas Hobbes had argued for a decade earlier, namely that the only means of ensuring civil peace, and preventing the domestic dissension that results from incommensurable and irresolvable theological claims was to establish a state religion. Thus, Locke argues what Hobbes portrays on the frontispiece of the Leviathan, that the prerogative of the sovereign is to maintain civil peace by wielding simultaneously both the crozier and the sword. Written within 7 years of the publication of Locke's two tracts, within 7 years after the publication of Locke's two tracts, and after having witnessed on the continent the peaceful coexistence of various religious faiths, Locke reversed his position by 180 degrees, publishing in 1689 his landmark treatise, A Letter Concerning Toleration, what people will likely have read or heard of. In that text, Locke insists that the state has no jurisdiction over the private belief of individuals and churches or synagogues or mosques to which people might belong, and that the state is charged solely with maintaining peace and providing the conditions for achieving the necessary material comforts of life. He describes, on the one hand, that a commonwealth, he says, the polity, seems to me to be a society of men constituted only for the procuring and preserving and advancing of their own civil interests, and describes these interests as life, liberty, and health, and my favorite, and indolency of the body, what we do every Sunday when football comes on. And, he added, the possession of outward things, such as money, lands, houses, furniture, and the like. Whereas, he goes on, a church I take to be a voluntary society of men joining themselves together of their own accord in order to the public worshiping of God in such a manner as they judge acceptable to him and effectual to the salvation of their souls. Now, while this is apparently the opposite position that he had held in the publication nearly 30 years earlier, in both instances, Locke elevates the central purpose of the sovereign to the maintenance of public peace within the boundaries of the state. The means change, indeed radically, but the end remains the same. In his second and more famous work on toleration, like his first, Defending Establishment, the state retains the sole authority and the sole discretion to constrain or limit religious practice where, in the judgment of the magistrate, those practices disturb or threaten civic peace. The sovereign still maintains a monopoly of power over belief, including the mandate to suppress various religions, including, notably, a religion that recognizes a sovereign beyond the domestic sovereign, Catholicism, precisely because there's a contending sovereign in Rome, but also to suppress disbelief in this case, right? In particular, the suppression of atheists whom Locke believes cannot be trusted to keep their word, their oaths, their contracts. Of course, this last being the basis of a successful liberal society, a contract that one can count on people keeping. Liberalism's core principle of disestablishment, the separation of church and state, was thus from the outset not fundamentally about religious liberty, but about establishing in principle and in practice the monopoly of state control to define acceptable and unacceptable religion, religious practice, and even belief or disbelief. Early on, it was understood that this principle could in practice be extended widely, in part to instill confidence in the state, but that it might be in fact exercised moderately, particularly if religions that constituted that regime understood a kind of self-limiting principle, mainly that the exercise of religious practice in particular would not touch on the sphere of public life, or certainly not disturb public peace. and would in fact allow for the peaceful securing of the material goods that were of central concern to the state. Thus, the seemingly neutral position in fact contained a set of substantive commitments that would prove educative for religious adherents, who, avoiding suppression, would come to internalize the norms of the liberal state. Those norms included an understanding of religion that stressed individual belief and conscience as paramount, and that cultivated a connection between private belief and the shared external ends and purposes of government, life, liberty, the indolency of the body. Those things particularly manifest in money, land, houses, furniture, and the like. Of course, given that this principle was established in a nation that was dominantly Protestant, it was of course obvious on its face that this condition was in fact one of religious liberty. Yet in principle, this form of liberty could be extended to any religion if that religion would adhere to these set of norms established as acceptable within the liberal state. Not only would the state reserve a monopoly of control over the churches, but a subtle, if powerful influencing in shaping a citizenry was institutionalized. One could and ought be at once personally pious, but also understand that piety was the trait of an individual within the context of a society whose public efforts was devoted to the pursuit of material wealth and comfort. In this way, a kind of allegiance born of gratitude would arise from religions toward the liberal state, even as there was a subtle undermining of certain core religious principles related to the material realm. Again, I'll quote Brad Gregory in his book. I quote, not by coercing confessional uniformity through one established church, but by permitting all individuals to worship within the respective churches of their choice, the state would maximize the obedience of citizens in a manner that reinforced power and stability. The disaster of the Reformation, as he puts it, might be redeemed by elevating into principle the individualism inherent in Luther's "Here I Stand." Might not all be permitted to stand where they pleased. Indeed, Gregory continues, it was to be hoped that individuals would be more obedient to the state and its laws because grateful, because free to believe and worship according to their own inclination and conscience. Then everyone would also share in the hope of material prosperity, perhaps even the embarrassment of riches that the Dutch demonstrated was the fruit of some measure of religious toleration linked with commercial initiative, scientific discovery, and Baconian ambitions to improve human life. I think at this point you're probably preferring my son to me. Thus, liberal control of the churches not only relied on occasional enforcement of coercive state limitation on religion, but a deeper shaping of norms and commitments. Religious belief was translated into the realm of opinion and conceived as a voluntary organization. Indeed, as Locke described religious membership in his letter concerning toleration, I quote, "No man is born a member of any church. Otherwise, the religion of parents would descend unto children by the same right of inheritance as their temporal estates. And everyone would hold his faith by the same tenure as he does his lands, than which nothing can be that which nothing can be imagined more absurd." There's more reality to your inheritance of land than to your inheritance of belief. Thus, membership in one state is a matter of birthright, at the very least tacit consent, and moreover becomes the one membership that we share in common with every other citizen. While religion becomes increasingly privatized, what we might think of as the private realm, material pursuits, money, land, houses, and furniture, becomes increasingly what defines us to be publicly committed to in common. Those activities especially protected and advanced by the state, the indolency of the body, become widely recognized as the shared and common pursuit of citizens within a liberal democracy, regardless of private religious belief. The domain protecting and enlarging activities focused on bodily satisfaction, the state, comes to be seen as the most fundamental and common human organization. Thus, it was not altogether inaccurate, perhaps disturbing, but not altogether inaccurate, when it was declared at the 2012 Democratic National Convention that the government is the only thing we all belong to. Let me turn now to the second wave. of a relationship between religion and the state, or religion and politics. What we might describe as a kind of national civil religion, which came to full flourishing in the middle part of the 20th century, though its lineaments were clearer for much longer. This lineaments included a kind of melding of national purpose and a diffuse and generalized Christianity that was present through much of the 19th century, expressed among other places in the belief in a manifest destiny, or the belief in America as a redeemer nation. But the high watermark of American civil religion was marked by the recognition in two landmark publications in the middle part of the 20th century. Will Herberg's book, Protestant Catholic Jew, published in 1955, and Robert Bellah's short essay, Civil Religion in America, published 12 years later in 1967. For all the significant differences of these two works, one, among other things, written by a rather Orthodox Jew, the other by kind of mainline Protestant who's had been a passionate communist while a student at Harvard, both works reflect recognition of an American civil religion that coexisted alongside a plethora of religious traditions that had once been seen as incompatible, and in certain respects that the civil religion absorbed them, or at least rendered them compatible with a national creed to which the various religions themselves increasingly conformed. Within this settlement, it was still widely understood that there was this thing called religious liberty. This is mentioned several times in Bellah's essay. And indeed, this was a time of remarkable flourishing of religion and religiosity, as has been described in recent works by George Marsden, Ross Douthat, and Yuval Levin, among others, a time of some nostalgia, as Yuval Levin describes this in his book, The Fracturing of America. But this religious liberty, which now came to fully include even once suspect faiths like Catholicism and Judaism, was in many ways extended precisely because American adherents of these traditions had come to embrace the American civil religion, indeed embrace it as in some respects their primary publicly held allegiance. Both Herberg and Bellah emphasize the way in which what they describe as what Herberg describes as an American way of life, or the American civil religion, does not displace the variety of religious faith traditions that define the landscape of American religious life. Herberg spoke of an American faith, and I quote, that manages to coexist with their formal religious affirmations and affiliations. While Bellah opened his essay with the claim, and I quote again, few have recognized there actually exists alongside and rather clearly differentiated from the churches an elaborate and well-institutionalized civil religion in America. So both of them recognize these are sort of coexisting, the civil religion and the various religious faiths. Both studies recognized that something fundamental had shifted in American religious life. That a distinctly American civil religion had now become capacious enough to include faiths beyond the traditional intermingling of Protestantism and Americanism. This is the central acknowledgement, of course, of Herberg's title, Protestant Catholic Jew, and the implied insight of Bellah's essay that is otherwise a fairly thin sketch, certainly in comparison to the massive cottage industry of scholarship that it inspired. But notably, Bellah's essay begins with citations from the Kennedy inaugural, and that in many ways seeks to show that Kennedy's invocation of God ultimately conforms to the long-standing understanding of the American civil religion as it had been established from figures ranging from Washington to Jefferson to Lincoln, and was being carried forward by Lyndon Johnson. In other words, Catholics, officially, as well as Jews, were incorporated into the American civil religion. And rather than being described any longer as a Protestant nation or even a Christian nation, its religion would henceforth be redescribed as the American civil religion, or sometimes Judeo-Christianity. Notably, both authors note that the inclusion of a non-Protestant tradition into this American faith was made possible by the transformations that liberal democracy had wrought upon those faiths. Herberg, in particular, recognized that the American creed didn't simply include those other traditions without first requiring of them a more fundamental alignment with the basic principles of the liberal creed. His book especially centered on the stories of the immigrant experience in America, which he called not a melting pot, but a transmuting pot, in which, quote, all ingredients are assimilated into an idealized Anglo-Saxon model. The signal of this transformation had taken place, doubtless, with the election of John F. Kennedy in 1960. That moment wasn't simply an acceptance of Catholicism by a Protestant America, but had been preceded by a public display of acquiescence by Catholic Americans, and in particular as represented by this representative of one of America's first Catholic families. The denouement of the American civil religion, in many ways, occurring around this time, was signaled in many ways by the address, the speech that Kennedy delivered before the Greater Houston Ministerial Association on September 12, 1960. When he appeared in order to explain his views on the relationship between his Catholicism and American democracy. In that speech, Kennedy sought to assure his countrymen, his Protestant countrymen in particular, that there was no conflict between his faith and his citizenship, between his religion and the oath that he hoped to take. In an oft-cited passage, this is what he said, quote, "I believe in an America where the separation of church and state is absolute, where no Catholic prelate would tell the president, should he be Catholic, how to act, and no Protestant minister would tell his parishioners for whom to vote, where no church or church school is granted any public funds or political preference, and where no man is denied public office merely because his religion differs from the president who might appoint him or the people who might elect him. I believe in a president whose views on religion are his own private affair, neither imposed upon him by the nation or imposed by the nation upon him as a condition to holding that office." And he went on, "Whatever issues may come before me as president, if I should be elected, on birth control, divorce, censorship, gambling, or any other subject — abortion was not an issue at this point — I will make my decision in accordance with these views, in accordance with what my conscience tells me to be in the national interest, and without regard to outside religious pressure or dictate, and no power or threat of punishment could cause me to decide otherwise." This transmutation, what Herberg describes as a transmutation of different faith traditions resulting from a close alignment with and increasingly an overarching devotion to the American civil religion, is the consequence of what my former colleague at Princeton, Stephen Macedo, has called the moderate hegemony of liberalism. In a 1998 article in which that's the subtitle, but which is titled "Transformational Constitutionalism," Macedo argued that liberal constitutionalism is, and rightly ought to be, he writes, a pervasively educational order, and not one that is neutral toward various forms of life. Among the shaping power or powers that it does and should employ is the effort to diminish, weaken, and attenuate, if not reduce outright, or even outright eliminate non-liberal beliefs, and especially non-liberal religions within the liberal order. At its most basic level, he argued, liberal law and practice, he wrote, quote, aims to shape people to help ensure that liberal freedom is what they want. That is, far from being neutral or indifferent about whether liberal freedom is or is not the proper way to understand and animate human choices, Macedo acknowledged that a liberal order appropriately and actively seeks to make men free, as he put it, in accordance with the liberal understanding of freedom. To do this, it must not only order the public realm in accordance with full access to liberal rights, to free and unencumbered choice, it must, he writes, also, quote, constitute the private realm in its own interest. Of central concern, then, is an area that may regard liberalism's attitude to be that of an indifferent toleration, religious belief, and the ways that religious belief is shaped and guided within the private associative realm of family and church. For example, of course, Macedo argues that liberalism cannot be indifferent to the education of children. He's written a book on education. Liberalism has a civic interest in shaping properly liberal souls, ones that will ensure that it is, quote, freedom that they want. Thus, and I quote again, if parents want their children always to be guided solely by sectarian religious teachings, both in politics and elsewhere, then their view of good citizenship is at odds with the liberal one. We have good reasons to hope that there will be fewer families raising such children in the future, he writes. In spite of the ominousness that some might perceive in that statement, this hegemony, he believed, largely operated at the level of subterranean influence, establishing sets of public norms and expectations to which people must eventually conform if they are to receive full acceptance within the American liberal order, enjoying official religious liberty, albeit under the powerful shaping force of that political order. This view of a pervasive American creed was shared by Herberg, who understood as early as 1955 that the substantive views of the American creed was coming to be adopted by all Americans, regardless of faith, traditions, and affiliations. That American religion he elucidated broadly again as the American way of life, what he called at one point a democratic faith, title of one of my books. That faith, he went on, centered on a set of common values and commitments: devotions to the Constitution, free enterprise, egalitarianism, especially marked by competition and mobility, idealism, optimism, humanitarianism, individualism, pragmatism, and so on. But Herberg also understood that there was far from a kind of seamlessness between the specific faiths of Protestantism, Catholicism, and Judaism, and the gods of this new faith, that the gods of this new faith had its own demands and its own commandments. He fretted in ways that the more sanguine Bella did not, about the corrosiveness or potential corrosiveness of this American creed. In one of his more telling passages from this book, he wrote, and here I'm going to quote, "From the point of view of the Jewish Christian faith, contemporary religion, the civil religion, is so naively and so innocently man-centered. Not God, but man. Man in his individual and corporate being is the beginning and end of the spiritual system of much of present-day American religiosity. In this kind of religion, there is no sense of transcendence. The values of life and life itself are not submitted to the Almighty God to judge, to shatter, and to reconstruct. On the contrary, life and the values of life are given an ultimate sanction by being identified with the divine. In this kind of religion, it is not man who serves God, but God who is mobilized and made to serve man in his purposes, whether these purposes be economic prosperity, free enterprise, social reform, democracy, happiness, security, or peace of mind." End quote. It is perhaps not unsurprising that this more orthodox Jewish author saw certain perils in the American civil religion in ways that the mainline Protestant Bella did not. The price of becoming a communicant in the American civil creed, he suggested, might be worth nothing more than a mess of pottage. This brings us then to today, the third wave, I suggest. 60 years after the publication, roughly, of Bella's essay. In the midst today of a massing third wave, in which secular liberalism is at once increasingly hostile to these older faiths, but yet at the same time appears increasingly to be a kind of faith of its own, as demanding, as insistent, as controlling as those faiths that we have purportedly left behind. In certain respects, one dimension of this new faith was anticipated and even hoped for by Bella himself, in the oft-overlooked conclusion of his 1967 essay. There, in those closing paragraphs, he expresses the hope that the American creed would ultimately become detached from America and detached from any nation, becoming a global creed, a new, and I quote, "a new civil religion of the world," and which would, he hoped, would signal the emergence of a genuine transnational sovereignty. He saw this development as, in some senses, the end of America in two senses, writing, and I quote again, that a world religion would be accepted as a fulfillment and not as a denial of the American civil religion. Indeed, such an outcome, he went on, has been the eschatological hope of American civil religion from the very beginning. To deny such an outcome, he wrote, would be to deny the meaning of America itself. Indeed, one might go so far as to suggest that Bella saw the American creed becoming Catholic. It's a small c, of course. The one true and universal church, world-straddling, the one faith outside of which no one would any longer live. This hope remains reflected today, among other places, in the ubiquitous programs of global leadership, global governance, internationalization, There's actually an Office of Globalization at my university, Notre Dame, which led to the creation of the first new school at Notre Dame in nearly a century, the School of Global Affairs. No puns will be made about that one. And of course, which have come to define central commitments of the churches of this new global religion, our colleges and universities. I noticed today on Calvin's website under Vision, and its announcement is changing its name to Calvin University, quote, by 2030, Calvin University will become a Christian liberal arts college with an expanded global influence. I'm so excited that finally there's a university devoted to globalization. We are only today seeing the lineaments of this new alignment of liberalism and religion. Indeed, liberalism as a religion, having gone from what was a moderate hegemony to a creed demanding adherence. This period of civil religion that preceded this moment was a kind of interregnum, a transitional phase between the institution of the principle that the churches would henceforth be controlled by the liberal state, if only occasionally, to one in which the two religions coexisted in seeming cooperation and mutual reinforcement for a time, but which increasingly either absorbed altogether the churches, reflected among other things in the disappearance of the mainline churches, more or less, or detaching itself from those remnant holdouts, the liberal order itself beginning to take on the features of a church with its creed, a soteriology, an eschatology, and increasingly an insistence upon orthodoxy and a profound focus on rooting out heresy and apostasy. At the heart of this creed is equal liberty, the equal liberation of all people from external restraints, limitations upon self-creation. The Lockean belief, that old belief that humans are by nature free and equal, was of course never anywhere true in nature. As Bertrand de Juvenel once put it, it was the fancy of a childless man who had forgotten his own childhood. But this equal freedom was increasingly realized through the massive architecture of the liberal state and market, and broadly speaking, the reshaping of society. And if you want any evidence of that, just pick up any piece of sociological literature studying whether people are in relationship with other people, and on every measure what you see is the success of our liberation from each other. However, it was that those last, most recalcitrant obstacles to equal liberty that required the heaviest lifting. The family, especially the fact and the consequences of human sexuality, and those religions that held firm to the teachings regarding sexuality. These last holdouts that led to an increasingly interventionist liberal state in these spheres especially. This now globalized effort led one philosopher, the Polish philosopher Ryszard Legutko, to remark upon the striking similarity of life under communism and life under liberalism, as its ideological nature has become manifest, especially in its now unveiled hostility toward biological limitations upon equal liberty and the religious faiths that maintain these teachings. Its eschatology has been, and always has been, a belief in progress, certainly in the material realm. This already evident in Locke's commendation of land, houses, and furniture, and those measures that we see lauded in recent works both by left liberals like Steven Pinker and right liberals like Jonah Goldberg. But two, progress is also understood as an historical progress, as on the one hand inevitable, hence one is either on the right side or the wrong side of history, but also constantly imperiled by an arrayed force of darkness and irrationality. Thus, on the one hand, one encounters a fragile, bitter combination of confidence in history's ultimate trajectory, statements found daily in both the likes of The Economist or even classrooms of deconstructionist English professors about the various inevitabilities of mechanisms of progress, be they a borderless world, various technological developments, complete sexual liberation, and moral amelioration. But alongside constant terror that this trajectory is being disrupted and derailed by evil forces, ones that rely typically upon illegitimate mechanisms and shadowy operators, the Koch brothers, Steve Bannon, Russian operatives, populism instead of democracy, and so forth. Heresy is keenly pursued, whether the dismissals of the likes of James Damore from corporate America or Brendan Eich, but especially and intensely denounced are the apostates. Why, for instance, the relatively mild illiberalism evinced in Hungary and Poland are vilified, while the oppressive illiberalism of Saudi Arabia goes largely uncommented upon, or why woke corporations sought to punish the recidivist regimes of Indiana, Arkansas, Arizona, and North Carolina for religious liberty laws, in each instance using tremendous financial power to overturn legitimate democratic legislation, while on the other hand benefiting from labor of near slaves in the Far and Middle East. Its soteriology consists often enough of what we call today virtue signaling, external commitment to the cause that Legutko remarks bears striking resemblance to the kind of public displays of loyalty that had been demanded and commanded under communism. In his important book, The Demon in Democracy, he writes, and I quote, "The liberal democratic mind, just as the mind of any true communist, feels an inner compulsion to manifest its pious loyalty to the doctrine. Public life is full of mandatory rituals in which every politician, artist, writer, celebrity, teacher, and any public figure is willing to participate, all to prove that their liberal democratic creed springs spontaneously from the depths of their heart." We transit from Kennedy's promise that his faith will have no bearing on decisions about birth control to one in which it is a matter of modern faith in his own party that birth control must be administered free of charge through the auspices of the state, or at least at the command of the state, even requiring organizations like Little Sisters of the Poor to participate in this liturgy of liberalism. We would find it altogether astonishing, unbelievable, objectionable, unthinkable were a Catholic politician or a Catholic Supreme Court justice, like the one who lives across the street from me maybe, to state that her faith commitments required the banning of all birth control. But that is in fact the opposite of that is the dogma of a major and indeed the majority party in America today, that access to free birth control must be mandated as a matter of federal law. While the former is regarded as an irrational faith commitment, the latter is regarded as a requirement of the indolency of the body, and indeed derives from a central tenet of liberalism, quote, "the right to dispose of my possessions and my person as I see fit," derived directly from the Second Treatise of Government by John Locke. This has ever been the purview of the liberal state, governing the liberation of the body, and we have arrived at a time when this commitment must increasingly be advanced not as a matter of, in a sense, neutral indifference or even moderate hegemony, but a matter of force by, among other means, as ever, controlling the churches. Appeals to religious liberty thus end up invoking the very mechanism by which the churches are now and ever were being controlled. To witness invocations of religious liberty, especially by conservative Catholics, is, let us say, ironic. But now they occupy the space that had been vacated by the liberals of one iteration, used now as a shield against liberals in a different iteration. Whether their effort will succeed against the third wave remains to be seen. But for the moment, it has proved to be moderately defensible against a wave that might be believed still to be gathering strength. So there might be still much to say, and I think I've treated this last topic rather cursorily, but in the interest of, I hope, learning from you about what my errors, many, many errors are, let me just conclude by saying that it seems to me that we are in the midst, in some ways, of this last and third wave. And a question that we face is whether in some ways we will be washed away by this wave or whether it might be followed by another that we can't yet see over the cresting wave. And on that question, and indeed on what that future may hold, I await with perhaps as much expectation as everyone in this room. Thank you very much.
All right, well, we'll take questions now. I'm just going to run around. If you have a question, please just raise your hand and form it as a question, please. Later on, we'll talk about, Calvin as the handmaiden of globalization.
I hope it will involve a lot of bourbon.
Yeah, right, exactly.
Thank you for that talk. Very rich, worth a lot of thinking. Can I actually ask two questions? I want to start off. First of all, in regard to the second settlement, civil religion, I wondered if implicitly there was a critique of John Courtney Murray, right? And Murray wasn't mentioned in this presentation, but I wonder if that conversation was behind there. The other question, though, is regarding that first settlement about religious disestablishment in the United States. And I wonder if that argument might be nuanced by actually paying attention to especially the dissenting Protestants who were asking for religious liberty, who were asking for disestablishment out of theological motives. And I think they're considering that might give some reason for so one question might be, why are they thinking that way? Why are they making those arguments? Why are Protestants themselves making arguments for disestablishment? Yeah. So those two questions.
Right. So it's interesting. I actually had a little section reflecting on my own university's sort of participation in the second settlement, civil religion, I think manifest especially in the fairly famous carving above the east portico of the basilica on the campus of Notre Dame, which reads "God, Country, Notre Dame," and which, well, I call him a kind of colleague. I was actually never overlapped with him, but Michael Baxter, formerly in the theology department and formerly a priest in the order that founded Notre Dame, addressed in a really extraordinary address that he delivered at a fall conference for the Center for Ethics and Culture about 10 years ago. The title of his paper was "God, Notre Dame, Country." And he thought that if Notre Dame had the appropriate understanding of the relationship of these three, of this sort of trinity, what Father Hesper called his trinity, that the order needed to be, in a sense, corrected, and that Our Lady's University, in particular, needed to hold the second position, in some senses, the church. It was, though, I think, in a period, and certainly anticipating a period in which I think the major role of a place like Notre Dame was precisely to participate in this settlement, indeed to both persuade America that Catholics were good Americans, and to persuade Catholics that we were also good Americans. I often remark to my students that you could go to a football game in every high school and college in Texas and never experience what you experience at the beginning of a Notre Dame football game, which is not only the national anthem, but America the Beautiful, while the preamble of the Constitution and the second paragraph of the Declaration of Independence are being recited. We can out-patriot even the Texans. But part of what was understood was that this was being broadcast in the national media as a way to demonstrate the patriotism, the suspect patriotism of these always suspect religious tribe. So I think you're quite right that Murray himself, of course, as the major intellectual figure in this period, was seeking, I think, to develop in his own way, and I think a distinct way, a way of formulating a kind of settlement, particularly for Catholics. But what that settlement in part insisted upon and it drew upon is maybe touches on your first question as well, which was that under the liberal state and under the liberal settlement, what Murray believed was that the sufficient neutrality of the state would ensure the flourishing of the various kinds of institutions and associations of society. Indeed, this was his major reason for endorsing what he regarded as this kind of liberal settlement and a kind of American civil religion, was that one could expect this extraordinary flourishing. And indeed, at the time that he wrote, as I mentioned, this was a time of extraordinary flourishing. Ross Douthat's book, Bad Religion, talks quite a bit about this. I mean, you had movies like Bernadette, the Song of Bernadette, winning the Academy Award, a movie about the woman who sees a vision of Our Lady in the grotto, and winning Best Actress Award as well. So there was reason to believe and have confidence in this. So that it strikes me that it was precisely from, in a sense, the confidence that was in some ways, or at least the argument that was asserted by an earlier generation of dissenting Protestants, that in the context of religious liberty in the context of a state that would be neutral among the various religions, that this would be a time and a place of an extraordinary flourishing of religious belief and capacity to pursue one's religious belief. Now, I think there was reason to have greater confidence among Protestants, dare I say, for that reason, because Protestantism always conformed more closely to the understanding of what constituted the safe practice of religious liberty. Religion understood primarily in the form of a private belief and individual conscience. It was always going to be more problematic, certainly for Catholics. But one of the things certainly I think articulated in Kennedy's response was that we too could join this settlement and confidently do so. But from where we stand today, I think religious people of various faith traditions are perhaps equally concerned and equally anxious, whether or not in the society that we certainly see unfolding today, not only whether there will be sufficient religious liberty for these institutions, as John Courtney Murray hoped, but whether in fact there will be enough people who will even want this form of liberty, whether this kind of associational life in the form of religion, form of family, in the form of the kind of communities of human beings will continue to be in some ways an arrangement that human beings will pursue. And gathering evidence seems to suggest, rather to the contrary, that we live lives of extraordinary solitude, with a full 40% of the American population reporting that they are lonely, not just now, not just today or this week, as a condition of life. That's extraordinary. Thank you.
Others? Surely there are more.
Thank you very much. I very much enjoyed your talk. Towards the beginning of your speech, you sort of made a claim of classical liberalism and conservatism in the United States sort of being analogous, or essentially almost the same thing. So I guess, would you sort of group thinkers, say like the fugitive agrarians or Russell Kirk, sort of in the camp of classical liberalism? So I guess I just sort of want to push back on that claim and see that there's also a strain in the American tradition, the American political tradition, that is not necessarily in the liberal state.
Yeah, I mean, I sort of completely agree, and it was shorthand for indicating what I think we might, what today we would kind of might call sort of mainstream conservatism, the sort that, as I indicated, is represented by someone like Jonah Goldberg or the National Review, for example, and which has always existed. As some of you who know with long enough memories will know, that there was a pretty ferocious debate between Jonah Goldberg and Rod Dreher at the time that Rod was writing about and eventually published his book, Crunchy Cons, and that Jonah saw this argument that was drawing from Kirk and Barry and even McIntyre at that time as fundamentally inconsistent with what he understood conservatism to be. And it was precisely that it lauded and indeed seemed to embrace a kind of vision of a kind of economic modesty, a form of localism as opposed to a certain kind of rootlessness, and even sort of certain kinds of constraints on the market that would benefit relatively smaller producers in favor of large conglomerates and corporate entities that Jonah regarded as sort of a heresy from mainstream conservatism. So I agree completely. I meant what I in many ways was indicating what has been for a long time mainstream conservatism. Of course, the news yesterday that the Weekly Standard may be shutting its doors is an indication that I may not be able to say this is mainstream conservatism anymore, because it doesn't have perhaps sufficient readership or interest, and certainly a declining electoral part of the population. So I'll have to maybe revise those remarks, not only in light of your remarks, but current events as well. That said, what's striking about your question is I've always been struck that when Kirk wrote about the American tradition, very interestingly, in his book, The Roots of American Order, he has a chapter on John Locke in which he insists that Locke had nothing to do with the American founding, that the American founding was really derived from essentially Judeo-Christian sources. So it's me rather striking that that Kirk was involved in a kind of construction of a civil religion in a certain way that kind of wanted to write Locke, at least, out of that story, but wanted to say the American tradition is more or less a continuous tradition from ancient Greece, Rome, the Hebrew Bible, the prophets, and so forth, into the modern time. And the only figure who had no influence on the founding was in America was John Locke. Maybe that was perhaps a bit of an interesting reconstruction, that dubious in its claims, but a very interesting one in light of your question. You're going to get your 10,000 steps, Kevin.
Run this out.
I'm just trying to put my mind around what you had mentioned earlier in terms, you said the American liberal creed would eventually become detached from America as a nation and kind of...
I didn't say that.
Or someone else
Robert Bella said that.
Yes, and you had kind of quoted that. I'm guessing on some level probably agreeing with the thrust of that. Maybe not. Yes. It leads me to think... If it's detached from the United States, a lot of times it's in the context of church and state, and we think of the state obviously with forms of government. Yeah. If this creed becomes detached from the United States and becomes more of a worldwide sort of creed, although I would see significant pushback from, let's say, Islamic nations, for instance, against that. But how would the churches then kind of, what is the state we would then be interacting with? Is the state some nebulous sort of big business sort of hammer down in terms of economics, like you mentioned with Indiana and some of these others, and that becomes the de facto almost state in terms of power and puts the churches in their place that would seem to put their heads up in the families? Or is this an actual forms of state in places that are co-opted? I mean, what does that look like?
I'm struck you would think I agreed with that claim. I mean, at some level, of course, I recognize the need for a degree of global coordination of various kinds of challenges that we face, particularly environmental. But what Bella there is arguing, or at least hoping and articulating, is that the American civil creed that he described, certainly I think that it manifests itself especially in a kind of again, what Herberg describes as the American way of life, one that is, really essentially features this belief in equal liberty that I ended by describing, the advance of the liberation of the self, particularly as it's attached to, what we can clearly see as a globalized economic order, that what Herberg hopes for is essentially that this creed, this American creed, will become a global creed and will be ultimately call upon a form of global governance. And as I suggested, what in some ways this would mean would be that all of humanity would be in some ways a part of this church, would be part of this new globalized creed that would no longer be American. It would simply be, let's say, a kind of liberal order itself, global liberal order, outside of which no one could live. And it was for this reason that at various points in this last section, that I invoked Richard Legutko, because it strikes me that Legutko in many ways is the figure who I think has best articulated what this looks like on the ground, especially as someone living in Poland who finds the kind of effort to advance this vision, a certain kind of vision of what constitutes the human future, in and through the various, what he regards as impositions by the EU on increasingly in forms that he regards as ideologically fraught and animated as it was living life under communism. It's a striking book. This is someone who has lived under the communist regime and under now the regime of the European Union, and writes this extraordinary book in which he says, while in many ways it's of course not as cruel and not as harsh, many of its objects are in fact quite similar. So I conclude that I introduced that section by alluding to Bella, because in what's striking about Bella's argument is that in many ways I think he anticipates this move toward this third settlement that I think we're in the midst of now, which in particular values, as we can see today, values a kind of borderlessness, if I can put it that way. a kind of unboundedness that when you ask the question of how will the churches relate to the nations, I think the assumption would be that increasingly there would not be nations as such. There might be administrative units, much like the states are. And certainly some of the architects of the European Union anticipated or even hoped that the European Union would look eventually like the United States, in which what had been sovereign nations would become administrative units of the European Union, much as our states have become administrative units of the United States. But as a consequence of that effort, that increasingly there would be a kind of homogeneity. And also, again, according to someone like Leguco, but we can even look closer to home domestically, and increasingly an effort in some ways to impose the condition of equal liberty, even upon parts of that particular geographic territory that would seek to resist it, whether it's the churches, whether it's individual nations in the case of Europe. So I quoted that, again, striking, and I've read this essay many times, Civil Religion in America, and those concluding paragraphs had never leapt out at me in the way that they leapt out at me this time. And it struck me as I've read a lot in this literature of civil religion, and not many people have remarked upon these closing lines of Bellow, and just I thought worth highlighting in the course of these remarks.
Okay, anyone on this half of the room? I got two over here, but.
So, Patrick, since it'll be 10 years before we get you here again, I wanted to ask you a quick question.
I'd be surprised if it's 10 years from now.
You know, JFK plays a large role in your tale tonight. I want to ask a little bit about MLK and a different sort of public engagement that the civil rights movement had, which strikes me as quite different from JFK's speech in Houston in that it was very public. It did not cede moral authority to the state in any way, but actually called the state to a higher authority from a very church-based movement, and that Martin Luther King directly appealed to not only Thomas Aquinas and Augustine, but to the Declaration and the Constitution, knowing that this was a check that had, not been paid, but the promises had been made. And given his people's history, the history of the African American church, and the sort of history they've had with the American political tradition, he still seemed to have hope that that check might be made good. So I wonder how that might complicate the three waves, if there might be another way of thinking about it in terms of revival, which also has a lineage in American history, and if Martin Luther King could see a hope for that with the institutions we've had, as flawed as they have been, might we also find some rays of hope, given the picture you painted tonight?
Yeah, thank you, Mike. I knew I'd get a question from you that I would not be able to answer. This is the problem with having students who, become formidable scholars. So congratulations. I guess one of the things that strikes me, of course, MLK was a student of Niebuhr, and Niebuhr himself, of course, understood both the promise and the peril of American life. And I think you see that in various strains of MLK's own thinking and articulation. So certainly when calling out injustices and calling especially that prophetic tradition. We hung around with Cornel West, and we heard a lot about this at Princeton. The prophetic tradition in America that was so closely aligned in the biblical tradition, the denunciation of injustice, and especially the injustice of the treatment of slaves. It's powerful. It's a powerful articulation, and MLK was able to tap into that. But I think maybe more than many thinkers in this period of this settlement, MLK also recognized the dangers of the achievement, in some ways, of this kind of intermingling of religion and Americanness. And I think perhaps, it's hard to say where he would have gone had he lived longer, but as in some ways the race question becomes at least seeming to move in the right direction, he becomes deeply involved in questions of what he sees as the kind of material imperilment of a kind of moral capacity for modern Americans. He sees especially both in, of course, the kind of not only the economic inequality, but the mad pursuit, the mad and mindless pursuit for material things that runs contrary to even certainly the thinkers like Aquinas and Augustine that he would evoke in one context. And of course also the gathering military forces that in some ways is one manifestation of a kind of effort to impose globally a certain kind of American way of life. Striking too that Will Herberg also in 1955 struck this note as well, a kind of deep concern that this American civil religion could easily turn into a kind of global effort to impose, and again, striking the contrast with someone like Bellow. So I think that this is really inchoate in terms of an answer, but I think that maybe in some ways as a kind of, in a certain way as a kind of outsider within, broadly speaking, the settlement, as an African American in particular, whose people had always been in some ways outside of the settlement, understood you could command a kind of moral position precisely by using that tradition, invoking that tradition. And in particular, of course, the Declaration in its statement of all men being created equal, and that drawing on the long Christian tradition of equal dignity under God. But I think he also saw, like Niebuhr did as well, and Niebuhr becomes a critic of where he sees American power moving, using that same set of resources to find a kind of danger within the settlement, a kind of overconfidence of American belief in its rightness and its power and its material wealth as itself corrupting. So I take it in some ways, what I've been in some ways articulating tonight is that Christians ought not to feel too much at home in any nation. And I think part of what has been the invitation, if you will, of the liberal settlement in its various guises, at least perhaps in the first two guises, is the belief that we could feel very much at home here. And I think what I see often invoked, especially among conservatives today, appealing to especially the doctrine of religious liberty, is that in some ways this is our rightful inheritance to live in a nation in which our faith is undisturbed. We're able to practice it undisturbed. And at least my argument tonight is to suggest it was never undisturbed. It was always in some ways going to be challenged by deep undercurrents within this regime that were always in some ways going to say the standard in some ways is not only what you might hold in the terms of your faith tradition, but it's comfort, it's indolency of the body. It's the kind of material life that's always been a great temptation, but certainly and perhaps above all in a nation of extraordinary and untold wealth and comfort and power. And that perhaps is the greatest threat to religious liberty today, not necessarily from what we're seeing from the third wave. It's kind of a threat.
I think there's a question over here. One follow-up to that, I think, I do wonder if you can get some leverage on this question by thinking about a distinction that is often used in that literature on civil religion between the prophetic and the priestly, right? That in some ways, perhaps MLK is tapping into that prophetic civil religious tradition. But anyway, where was the question?
That's really helpful. Again, that's Cornell West would remind us of that.
So the question.
So this is a student of mine who's got to be very careful now.
I was going to say that this student question won't be nearly as hard as that one.
Sorry.
But and you may have actually already partially addressed the question, but the inestimable Tocqueville describing the March of Democracy, as you're very well aware, describes it, that he feels the sense of religious terror or dread in anticipation of this movement forward. But what my question is what is the mechanism that's driving these waves? Is it something similar to what Tocqueville was seeing? Because in one sense, and this is kind of a question I've had about your recent book and your project generally, is a political theory I don't think is enough to drive waves of cultural change, right? It has to be something that reaches down into nurseries and cradles and schools, it has to be in the home. And so in that sense, it would seem to be need to be something more fundamental than an elite attachment to a certain political philosophy or ideology. What is the mechanism that you see driving each of these waves?
Yeah, great. It's a great question. Yeah, it's the first piece I've ever written or talk I've ever given where I didn't mention Tocqueville, and I thought this would be a landmark moment, and you've ruined it for me. So Tocqueville suggests that it's actually the condition, or what he calls he eventually calls it equality of conditions, but it's the introduction of a belief in equality that is the driving mechanism. And he attributes this to a series of developments in human history. He says it's 700 years have driven this process forward, that he says it's both comes from theological sources, the incarnation. He says it comes from material sources, the transformation of the economy. It can sound a little Marxist, it's the means of production. It's transformations in the intellectual realm. And far from me not to just agree with Tocqueville, but I think, and I think I don't contradict Tocqueville in a certain way, that what at the heart of his understanding of equality is also an understanding of a kind of liberty. As I suggested, in fact, this was the implicit citation to Tocqueville, that it's a certain understanding of equality that aligns with a certain understanding of liberty. And I mean this in the following way. There's a chapter, it's like the second favorite chapter by every conservative who reads Tocqueville. The first favorite chapter is the one where he says, the state's going to take everything over, the tutelary state. But the second favorite chapter of every conservative is the chapter in which he says, people in a democratic age will love equality more than they love liberty. They will sacrifice liberty in order to be equal. It reminds you of that story by Kurt Vonnegut called Harrison Bergeron, where after the 211th, 212th, and 213th amendments to the Constitution that declared that everyone was equal, they institute a office of the handicapper general in the United States government, whose job it is to make sure that if you're not equal, that you will be equalized. So if you're more beautiful than someone else, you have to wear a mask that makes you average. Or if you're stronger, you'll have to wear weights that make you average. And if you're smarter, you'll have to wear headphones that make a loud noise, like all of our students wear now, that will make you average. And this way, we'll all be equal. We'll love our equality more than our liberty. But in fact, what Tocqueville also argues in that chapter is that there comes a point at which equality and liberty touch each other and intermingle. And he says this is the point to which democracies will tend. So liberal democracies have a telos, he says. They have a natural telos to equal freedom. He says, and this equal freedom is one in which you are equal because you are free, and you are free because you are equal. You are equally independent of each other, he suggests. That this form of equal liberty is the trajectory or the telos to which liberal democracies will tend. Our desire to be liberated from any restraining or limiting force outside of our lives. And you can see this, of course, in any form of popular culture. Think of the Western, for example, or kind of the desire, the road novel, the desire to get out. Right? Read Little House on the Prairie. And every one of those books is about, as soon as they settle somewhere, Pa says, we have to leave. And then the beginning of the next book is Pa said we had to go somewhere, and the rest of the book is Ma trying to make a home. And the great tragedy of those stories is at the end of every book, Pa says we got to go somewhere else again. This is the story that we love. Right? It's actually at the heart of a movie that we're all going to watch if we haven't already watched it yet. It's a Wonderful Life. Because George Bailey wants nothing else but to get out of Bedford Falls. And it's only these terrible set of interventions of fate that force him to stay in this town that he wants to get out of because he wants to build great buildings and big, long bridges. And he ends up saving the town, but it's almost despite of himself that he ends up saving it. But notice he also creates the first suburb through his savings and loan, which is going to destroy America. This form of equal liberty, then, is liberty, the liberation of ourselves from other people. It's not simply the political liberty to say only a government by consent is legitimate. It's to say only a life in which I have consented to every aspect of my life is legitimate. And consenting to every aspect of my life means everything has to be put under a kind of question, is there something better? Is the relationship I'm in right now the best I can do? God save you young people who have Tinder and these apps in which you're not just trying to pick, a mate from a college campus, but the entire world. Trust me, you'll never find the perfect person. So just fall in love with somebody here. But the belief that there's always something better, right, becomes this kind of imperative, always to be, as Tocqueville talks about this imperative to restlessness, this anxiety that something better might just lie around the corner. So what he's describing then is this condition of equal liberty in which liberty is the liberation from other people and, of course, also from nature. The liberty from the natural world, including ultimately our own biology, which is also very limiting. Why ultimately, you've been reading the stories, this is all about, this will all culminate in our ability to basically make ourselves, not just make ourselves in the decisions we make, but literally biologically make ourselves, make our offspring, select the kind of offspring that we want. So on the one hand, of course, I want to suggest that this all derives in some senses from political theory, but you could also, this arises as well from every domain of life. It's theological, because what it also involves is a redefinition of what constitutes liberty. At the beginning of Democracy in America, Tocqueville describes American democracy as this wondrous and extraordinary practice that has developed out of the soil of America. It didn't come from England. In a sense, it came from England. I'll give a shout out to Protestantism here. He says it's from the Puritans. And he says, in particular, it's from the Puritan understanding of liberty. And he quotes Cotton Mather right at the beginning of Democracy in America, in a very lovely quote. He says, a beautiful definition of liberty, he says, is the liberty that understands that liberty ultimately has to conform also to authority. And it's not only external authority, it's an internal authority, the capacity to live with a kind of discipline over the self. And that only when you discipline the self so that the best part of ourself is manifest and the worst part of ourself is governed, have you achieved the condition of liberty. That's what liberty is. And he says that's the source of American democracy in America that he sees in the New England townships and that he praises at the beginning of Democracy in America. But over the course of the text Democracy in America, he says a different kind of democracy will emerge, and it's the democracy of this liberated self, of this detached self, whose understanding of liberty is that I achieve freedom when I am no longer bound or limited by any other human being, by any place, by any time, by any history, by any tradition, by any religion. That the religion itself has to conform to this understanding of liberty, and all of human life will have to conform to this understanding of liberty. And it's this understanding of liberty then, I would suggest, that becomes the mechanism. This becomes the mechanism. It's an altered and transformed understanding of liberty that lies, I think, at the heart of this transmutation of the relationship in some ways that Herberg describes, from the point in which, in some ways, you believe that you have the liberty to practice your religion to the point in which we are today, in which increasingly, if you have a religion that doesn't believe in the complete liberation of the self, you have to be controlled and forced to love liberty in the way that Macedo describes in his essay. Be forced to choose liberty. So that I would describe as the kind of mechanism that we can describe in many different ways and through many different disciplines, but I think underlies this, let's say, transformational form of liberalism in which we're living today.
Well, I'm grateful that you brought up Tocqueville. Thank you for that. We are past time, so would you join me once more in thanking Patrick Deneen?